Hi everyone. So we are at the point where we have learned opening direction, axis of symmetry, vertex, how to solve it looking at the graph and using a function, minimum and maximum, how to solve it on a graph, zeros, how to solve it on a graph, domain, how to solve it on a graph. We are going to graph this parabola today. I'm going to have it on my big whiteboard. You are going to get a copy of this paper, but you're going to make yourself some really good notes. You should already have notes about all 6 of these areas. They should be nice and organized because now it's the time where we are going to start to put it all together and take assessments. And we're going to complete an IXL and we're going to practice for our test. So here is a graph that you should have drawn on your paper. And here is a function, and we are going to learn how to solve this looking at the graph. Well, we're going to review how to solve this looking at the graph and looking at the function. So here's my whiteboard. I drew it out on my board. I drew out the parabola exactly as it was on my paper. I counted down. I made sure I was at the right spot for all of these different points. And then I did my example. And over here, I have my example, and I have all of the characteristics that I need to write about all the things that I've learned. So here's my equation. And we know this is our A value, this is our B value, and this is our C value. And we really didn't do anything with our C value, but we definitely used our A and our B value. Since we see in this picture that this parabola opens upwards, and we come to A and we see that A is positive because there's no negative sign here, we know that this opens up. So we're going to write up underneath opens. That's our first bullet. It's our first thing that we need to do. If this parabola was going down or there was a negative sign before A, we would say that it opens down. For AOS, we know our formula is negative B over 2A. So we are going to look up here and we see our B is 2. So we put our negative sign and our 2 times we see our A is 1. So that's how we're going to find AOS mathematically. So 2 times 1 is 2. So we have negative 2 over positive 2, which gives us a negative 1 for our AOS. So we could write X equals negative 1, and that's the answer for our AOS. Now, I can also look at my graph. If it just shows me a graph, I know my AOS is the point where the graph comes down, hits a point, turns and goes back up. So my AOS is right here. And I can draw a little dotted line down to separate and show my AOS. This is my AOS. And I can find out what the value is by going to my origin. I go over 1, and I know that I'm going to have X equals negative 1 for my AOS. All right, and I wrote that over here. I've solved it mathematically, or I can look at the graph. For the vertex, if I'm looking at a graph, is the point where the graph comes down, stops, and turns. I already know my X value is negative 1. To find my Y value, I'm going to go over 1 and down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I know my vertex is going to be negative 1, negative 9. And I answer vertex in X, Y form. That's if I have a graph. If I don't have a graph and I'm just given this equation, which could happen, which will happen, I can solve it by taking my AOS and plugging it into my original equation. So my original equation was X squared. In the place of X, I put negative 1 squared plus 2. My X is going to be times negative 1, and then minus 8. So negative 1 squared is positive 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2 minus 8. And 1 minus 2 minus 8, that's a hard one to do, so I might get out my calculator and put it in my calculator. If not, I know mathematically it's negative 9. So I know my vertex is going to be negative 1, negative 9. That's my answer, solving it mathematically. So I can solve it on a, it's so easy. If you have a graph, use the graph. If not, you have to do this formula. You do know how to do it. Here are your notes. So the minimum value or the maximum value. Sometimes we might have a maximum. If the equation is negative and it's going down, we'd have a point up here and it would be a maximum. In this case, since we're opening up, we already know this is positive. This is opening up. We know that we're going to have a minimum. So we're going to circle minimum. And I can tell minimum from A's value and from the fact that I wrote opening up. If I'm opening up, it means I'm coming down and I have a minimum value at the bottom. If I'm looking at a graph, I can look at it and see my minimum is down here. So I'm going to circle my minimum, and my minimum is going to be my y value, which is negative 9. So I'm going to write that down as my answer. And then I'm going to talk about my zeros. And we learned last week that zeros are the places where the line, the graph comes down and crosses x. This is my x-axis. This is my y-axis, right? That's something we know already. X goes this way, y goes this way. So I can't, if I'm just given this, I won't be asked to find zeros. I will only be asked to find zeros if I have a graph, a parabola. And I see that this is the x-axis and it crosses here and it crosses here. So it crosses twice. And we learned most of the time it crosses twice. Sometimes if it's just on the x-axis, it only crosses once. Or sometimes if it sits above the x-axis or below the x-axis, it's not going to cross it at all. But in this case, our parabola comes down, crosses twice. That will be what happens most often. So if I go over 1, 2, I know my first zero is negative 2. And I know that my second zero, if I count over 1, 2, 3, 4, is negative 4. So I have two zeros, negative 2 and negative 4. Again, I'm only going to solve zeros if I have a graph. I'm not learning to solve them mathematically yet. You might eventually, but not yet. Domain. So domain, we know, is always, oh guys, I hope you're answering right now, is always all real numbers. And I don't feel like writing all real numbers, so I'm going to use that special fancy R to write my all real numbers. So it's just an R with an extra little line down. Okay, and then I'm going to go to range. And I know I have a minimum. So here is my point. So I know my range is y values. So it's going to be everything above here. And since I'm going up, it's going to be greater than. So I know I'm going to write y is greater than or equal to, because it's all these numbers up above. And my lowest point right here, my minimum point, I already found out was negative 9. So I solved for negative 9 when I found my vertex. And I solved for negative 9 when I found my minimum. But negative 9 is going to be my range. You might also sometimes see it written as negative 9, comma, infinity. So it could be written either way. Most of the time you're going to see it written this way though. So listen, this is really important. You should save this video somewhere because you're going to start to have to take a graph or an equation, and you're going to have to start to solve the opening direction, the AOS, the vertex, the minimum, the maximum, the zeros, the domain, and the range using this. This is a perfect cheat sheet. These notes, all these steps are watching this video, again, saving it, is a perfect way to complete your work over the next 2 weeks and prepare yourself for the quiz that you're going to have before